Welcome to this evening's session of the Forum 2029 series. My name is Jack Canham. I'm Head of Communications here at the Autonomy Institute. I'm really grateful to all of you who are joining us live tonight, equally to anyone who's maybe watching this back online on our YouTube channel. Over the last few months, we've been diving in at Forum 2029 to a wide range of policy questions, looking to, with an eye to the kind of shared, bold, radical progressive vision we think has been sorely lacking for mainstream political debate in the last few years. I guess with the Labour Party deputy leadership contest underway, new Green Party leader, beginnings of a new Left Party, maybe this is starting to change a bit. So we're really glad we've got started putting some policy on the agenda too. Autonomy, we think, to put a bit more context onto the Forum 2029, there's been a profound gap in the UK's policy agenda. The absence of transformative, hopeful solutions that could really genuinely improve people's lives. Too often what we've had from political centre has been piecemeal, incremental, a bit uninspiring. But the radical right has been unafraid to put forward a worldview that really resonates with people's fears and frustrations, even if it deepens inequalities and is unappealing to many as well. And so at Forum 2029, it's been our attempt to build the outlines of a different kind of policy platform that's ambitious, confident, and rooted in people's lived experience. This week, I'm really excited. We're shifting the focus a bit outwards beyond the domestic sphere, though always with the UK's role firmly in view, looking at UK policy and the crisis in global South living standards. We knew when we were constructing this series of events on the issue of living standards domestically that many of the topics we've been covering are also really inextricable from the UK's location within the global economy, structures of imperialism, histories of empire, and so on. In short, that the UK's economic, trade, financial structures have been implicated in shaping the lives and livelihoods of people quite far beyond its borders, often in deeply damaging ways. So that's from debt dependency, extractive trade arrangements, fair tax regimes, and much more beyond. We know that ongoing practices here constrain the political economic futures and the living standards of many of the global South as well. So that's why we put together a panel that could really tackle some of these global policy questions head on, put forward a progressive agenda that might be taken towards the international stage, beyond the status quo and all of its all too apparent and currently pretty hideous shortcomings. So, what should a progressive government committed to challenging the global stagnation and problems in living standards beyond the domestic sphere be committed to? So a few quick notes before we start. Each of our speakers is going to open with a contribution of about 10 minutes, outlining some of the key challenges, opportunities, and policy ideas around that theme. I'll then ask them to try and sharpen that intervention into a distinct policy, or maybe more, a distinct policy or more that they could put forward to a Forum 2029 platform. And after that, we'll open up to questions from you who are watching and between the panel beyond. So you can drop these into the chat at any point in the discussion as well. I'll try and pick them up, or use the raise hand function at the end as well if you'd like to come in directly. The event's being recorded. I will circulate details of how to find it after the event as well. So I'll do a few quick introductions of our panel before I hand over to each in turn. So Alex Cobham is an economist and is chief executive of the Tax Justice Network. It's been a researcher focused on illicit financial flows, effective taxation for development, and inequalities at places from Oxford University, Christian Aid, and beyond. Really excited to have him this evening. Nick Dearden has been Director of Global Justice now since 2013, and a campaigner against corporate globalisation and for global economic justice for over 20 years. He was a leading voice in the UK and the European movement against the now abandoned EU-US trade deal, TTIP. So I'll be really interested to hear from him. Dr. Devika Dutt is lecturer in development economics at King's College London, where her research focuses on the political economy of foreign exchange intervention, central bank swap agreements, and a political economy of development policy. She's also a co-founder of Diversifying and Decolonising Economics. And finally, Jerome Phelps is head of policy and advocacy at Debt Justice, an organisation campaigns for the cancellation of unjust debt and a fairer global financial system, where he works on debt, climate justice for the global South, has written very, very widely beyond this as well. I've seen Jerome's articles come up in many places. So I'm delighted to have all of them with us. Without further ado, I'm going to first hand over to Alex. I believe I've put in a running order. So I will pin him to the screen and give him his 10 minutes.
It's painful. Thanks, Jack, and to Autonomy for the invitation. It's great to be part of what I think is going to be a great panel. So I'll get myself out of the way so we can hear from others. But look, speaking first, we can't begin a discussion about UK policy and living standards in the global south without recognising the UK's support, both logistical and political, for the genocide being carried out by Israel against the Palestinian people. And not unrelatedly, we can't begin that discussion about UK policy and living standards in the global south without recognising the multiple dimensions of UK responsibility over centuries. And when I say recognising, I mean there are so many major dimensions that we should be talking about taking in an inventory. But I've only got 10 minutes, so we'll stick to three main dimensions. The first and most obvious is the central role of the British Empire in centuries of violent exploitation and economic extraction, processes that continue to shape the distribution of wealth today, both between and within countries. Second, the UK has been a key driver in the overconsumption of planetary resources, undermining the future opportunities to live a good life for everyone in this planet. And the third, and this is where I'll focus really, the UK has played an equally central role in the creation in the last century of an international financial system and international tax rules that ensure the continuation of that process of economic extraction that began under empire, by providing the means to both avoid and evade taxation and financial regulation all around the world. So I'm going to come back to all of that, but just to say, in these three dimensions, we need to recognise the damage is not mutually distributed, although it's pretty widespread. And instead, the UK has contributed to the denial of prospects for human flourishing in a way that systematically disadvantages people in the global south above all others. But at the same time, we can see Aimé Césaire's imperial boomerang coming back to hit us in the face. The same processes have done significant damage to the UK and its people as well. And the positive aspect of that is that there are some really powerful ways that UK policymakers can act today that would have benefits both in the UK and across the South. If we could mention one of our former prime ministers, he would refer to this as win-win, and it kind of really is. I'm not going to name him for obvious reasons, but this is clearly a case where everyone can benefit from UK policymakers being just a bit less bad. So this is what I'm talking about, is that the realm of tax justice. We've talked about there being three ages of illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows being that combination of not just cross-border tax abuse by multinational companies and wealthy individuals hiding their assets offshore, but also all of the other cross-border flows around corruption, the theft of state assets related to market rigging and so on. That rely on the same types of financial secrecy, anonymous company ownership, and other measures to flourish. If the first great age of illicit financial flows was the imperial robbery and the colonial drain and so on, the second age was what Vanessa Ogle, the historian, has called funk money, when those people and companies who had done so well under empire, extracting from colonies, suddenly became concerned by a combination of factors. Firstly, the introduction and increase of direct taxation in the metropolis to fund wars in Europe. And secondly, the growing movement towards independence of those colonies and the possibility of reappropriation of the expropriated assets that those people and companies held. So they looked for places that had the protection of empire, where they could park their ownership of those assets and income streams, but without facing the taxation of the metropolis. And the most obvious place where this flourished was in smaller UK colonies that operated under the same set of laws broadly, but had the independence to put in place the kind of financial measures and tax measures that allowed the funk money protection from both of the risks that it faced. And that developed through the 20th century into the third age of illicit financial flows that we're in now, where really that type of provision of secrecy and the means to avoid regulation and taxation elsewhere has become not marginal, but absolutely at the core of the global economic system. It is the economic system that we live in. Now look, the Tax Justice Network publishes 3 annual or rolling reports that give you different ways of looking at the scale and nature of these problems, and they all tell us the same thing. So the first one is the Financial Secrecy Index that we began publishing in 2009, and that looks in detail at each jurisdiction, at the degree of secrecy they provide in different ways, along with the financial services that they're exporting. So how much damage are they risking to the rest of the world through the secrecy that they provide? The second is the Corporate Tax Haven Index, and that focuses particularly on the role of tax abuse by multinationals and which jurisdictions make that possible to the detriment of all others. And third is the State of Tax Justice, which provides global and national level estimates of the revenue losses suffered due to the cross-border tax abuse, both of multinationals and wealthy individuals hiding their assets offshore. And that allows you to see both how much each country is losing, but also what share of the global losses each country is responsible for. And the State of Tax Justice, just as with the 2 indexes, tells the same story. The UK and its set of dependent territories is the single biggest actor responsible for the risk of illicit financial flows, the scale of profit shifting, the scale of revenue losses suffered around the world. Out of a global total of revenue losses of about $500 billion each year, the UK is responsible for a bit more than a third, depending on the measure you take. So there's an enormous opportunity for the UK simply to stop doing damage. And it's an opportunity that far outstrips the benefit of the UK going back to giving a little bit more development aid or being a bit less bad in the way that it gives aid. If the UK was to lead in fighting illicit financial flows instead of fomenting them, the global impact, especially in the South, where those revenue losses make up a bigger share of current tax revenues, a much bigger share of public health spending, for example, the benefits would be felt disproportionately in the South. So, Jack, policies. I have two to offer. The low-hanging fruit is a slightly narrow niche measure that nobody's heard of called public country-by-country reporting. Simply to get multinationals to report, put them on a level playing field with domestic businesses. So for each country they operate in, they report the scale of their economic activity, their employment, their sales made, then the profits they declare and the taxes they pay. Where it's been introduced, this measure has been shown to increase, with no other measures in place, to increase the effective tax rate of multinationals by several percentage points. That might not sound like a lot, but we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars if that's applied globally. The UK was the first country to legislate to make this possible in 2016, and it has never used that legislation under any government. It doesn't even require us to pass a law. The Chancellor could wake up tomorrow morning and with a stroke of a pen, we could have this data. And of course, the benefits would flow especially in the South, although the UK itself would make additional revenue of billions of pounds a year. The biggest stretch, and I'll close with this, is that we are now, for the first time ever, negotiating a globally inclusive set of tax rules at the United Nations, instead of having these set either by the imperial powers at the League of Nations or its successor at the OECD. It is a crucial moment for countries that have been part of that power dynamic over a century to join with the G77, I should say, and the rest of the world at the UN and put forward measures to create a framework that benefits everyone, especially when we have the United States trying to bully everyone out of their tax sovereignty. This is a moment for countries to come together to everybody's benefit. And the UK could play a vital role if it was to find some backbone. Now's the time. leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Both wonderfully succinct and to time, and again, a wonderfully clear policy at the end. You do wonder, so we're looking for tax revenue at the moment, if our current chancellor might be interested in it. You wonder why not. Fantastic. Thank you to Alex. I'll keep us moving quickly, and we'll definitely return to discuss some of that, but I'll move us quickly on to Nick for his contribution.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. And there's going to be quite a bit of crossover in perspective, as I'm sure you would expect, with what Alex has just said. I think the first thing I want to say is that really everybody, from the left right through to the centre, to even the centre right, is in shock at how bad this government has been on international issues. And I say that as somebody who didn't expect anything from this government, or didn't think I was expecting anything from this government, but nonetheless, they find a way of disappointing me every single day. First of all, as Alex quite rightly says, and I think we can't start a meeting without mentioning it on international issues, not just the whitewashing, but the complicity in a genocide. The president of that genocidal state is in London as we are speaking tonight. The criminalisation of some of those protesting against that genocide, the continued negotiation of a whole series of trade deals that they effectively inherited from Boris Johnson, with no change of objectives, no additional transparency or consultation. In fact, in many ways, their accountability has been even worse than recent governments, if such a thing was possible. And finally, as critical as I have been over the years about it, the slashing of the aid budget to its lowest level since the early 1990s, and the effectively using that the money saved to boost military spending. That series of policies or lack of policies isn't just shocking to me, it's shocking the mainstream centrist opinion. We have far more former international development workers in this parliament than we've ever had in any parliament in our history by a very long way. And yet all those people who campaigned for international development for years have been utterly silent while all this is taking place. So it, in many ways, is a very difficult and frightening moment. But I want to try and give another way of looking at it. And I, again, kind of take inspiration on that from Alex, because I'm on a WhatsApp group with him. And I think a few months ago, he said, well, if nothing else, this is a moment of clarity. And it is a moment of clarity, and we have to use it, I think, in that way, because even at its best, Labour's international development agenda, and from the mid-90s, that agenda is the traditional way that Labour has dealt with the issues that we're discussing tonight, and which, in some ways, we have to be honest, was, there were some aspects of that which were impressive in 1997, but in other ways, much of that agenda was always really quite problematic, because it rested on assumptions that global poverty was disconnected from international economic structures, disconnected actually from global inequality. There was this idea that it didn't matter how much inequality of, Peter Mandelson famously said, couldn't care less how much the rich got richer, as long as people at the bottom weren't very poor. And that was a central assumption in Labour's international development policy. And also, secondly, that aid was the central solution to this deeply unjust, essentially neo-colonial economy. And I never believed that was the case. I'm sure many of us here didn't, precisely because we live in a world where most countries are bled of their resources, their potential wealth, in order to accumulate wealth here in the core of the former imperial countries. And that happens through a number of mechanisms which Britain has been an active participant in creating and pushing on the world, from international trade rules that I particularly work on, through to a debt and tax system that Alex and Jerome are specialists in, even in some cases, the use of aid spending, all backed up in the final analysis, of course, by military force. And so I think it's an important moment for us to step back and rethink fundamentally the role that Britain plays in the world and Britain's relationship with the global South. And for me, it's not simply about our history. Of course, what Alex said about our history is all true. And it's very important to understand that if you want to understand why some countries are so rich and some countries are so poor in the world, and reparations are clearly owed, there's no question about that. But actually, the more pressing problem for me is that the current structure of the international economy is still neo-colonial. It's not historical. It's today. It's a perfect description of the world economy, actually, and no amount of aid is going to change that. So while I certainly don't support the cutting of aid, because people will surely die as a result of that decision, at the same time, I don't think it should be at the core of what we should be calling for if what we want is a just international economy. Now, I've been asked to be specific here about a policy prescription, and I will come to that, I promise. But it is certainly hard to think of individual policy prescriptions that will be silver bullets, when what we really need to do is completely reorient the trade and financial system built up by globalization from the late 1980s, which at their heart are extractive and neo-colonial, a complete disaster for climate change, quite apart from the justice issues that it creates in the world. But there certainly are steps that a government could, if it wanted to, take right now, and I will come back to what they are in a minute. But first of all, let me give you two reasons for hope on this, because I think hope is in short supply, and we need to bear in mind there is potential in this situation, as scary as it is. First of all, the first bit of hope I've got is that geopolitics is changing rapidly. So Trump is in a battle with particularly China, but other BRICS countries too, for control of the highest value segments of the world economy. That's ultimately what he's trying to do. It isn't a battle I don't believe that he can win in the long term. In fact, I believe that some of what he's doing is going to exacerbate the very thing he wants to stop. I think nobody is rubbing their hands more than China, actually, at some of Trump's activities on the world stage, because he is pushing countries like India and Brazil to increasingly de-link from the US economy, de-link from their dependence on the US economy. And that will move us to a multipolar world. Now, that isn't a world at the moment, unfortunately, that is filled with left-wing governments, as much as I would love it to be. But nonetheless, it is a world where I believe many governments in the global south are going to be pushed by self-interest to move towards policies which are far more about South-South cooperation and incorporate far more resource sovereignty into their worldview. And I think both those things are important. And we're seeing that already from Indonesia to Mexico to Colombia, with countries realizing that the West is desperate to get its hands on their critical minerals, and actually they're not just going to give us those metals at any price that we dictate to them. They want to use it to move up the value chain. And I think that's a positive thing. There are huge battles going on between the EU, for example, and Indonesia at the WTO at the moment over this. And I think it's really important that we stand with those countries, however problematic their governments may be. This, for me, is a positive shift in the world. Second, I think we've really got to think about how we can communicate all of this. And here again, I think there's an opportunity, because the old Labour international development model relied, I would argue, on values like altruism and pity. And while this is a bit of a caricature, of course, it was seen by many, many people as a form of charity. Those people made a right mess of things over there, but we can afford to help them out. It's kind of at the center of it, a kind of white saviorism, essentially. Now, that's bad in itself, but also it's not going to work. It's not going to work in the long term as a way of convincing people that the world needs to change. And in particular, we saw that, right, when this agenda came up against austerity in our own country, and many people felt, well, okay, charity's all very well, we've got money, but we haven't got money anymore. So, we can't afford it. And I think that's all part of the slide away from international development and aid in the public imagination. So I think we need a fundamentally different way of explaining what we're trying to do. And I think it's possible at the moment. But I'm not saying it's easy. What we've got to do is shift the debate from one of us versus them in national terms, in global north and global south terms, into one of us versus them in terms of people versus the super rich and people versus corporations. And I think you're seeing bits of that. Very excited by Zach Polanski's election as leader of the Green Party, because I think he incorporates some of that thinking, and that kind of left populism, I think, gives us some ideas here of how we could argue for this. Much of Labour's 97 policy was premised on the idea that globalization was a jolly good thing, and development was effectively about helping others who were not able to participate in globalization to do so they could enjoy it too. That's the premise in how Labour thought about these, how Blair thought about these things. We're not in that place now at all. I think many people in the global north think that we need to de-globalize, in many ways. And I would agree with that to some degree, depending on what you mean by deglobalize, of course. I would agree with that in many ways. I think our task is to show that we can deglobalize without beggaring our neighbor. We can, for goodness sake, China did not invent globalization, whatever Trump says. US corporations invented it. China played the West at its own game and did so quite well. But the real villain is corporations and big finance. And that's something that maybe, just maybe, we can use to win people over to an agenda of deglobalization based on a genuine internationalism. And I think it's possible because very few people surely now believe the free market is the answer to our problems. The free market does not resemble anything like a Adam Smith-style farmer's market. Of course, it resembles monopoly capitalism, which is what it is. And how do you deal with policy capitalism, with monopoly capitalism? And here I'll come on to my policy descriptions. You need to constrain international capital. And that is something that a Labour government in this country should be doing. It is something we can start doing here and now. First thing I would say, probably my number one option would be legislation to hold transnational corporations to account for how they operate, both in this country and overseas. That's something CORE, it used to be called CORE, it's called CJC now, is proposing. So there's going to be a campaign coming around that soon. Given so much of our role, so much of the corporate influence that we exert on the world is financial, I think finance needs to play a particularly important part there. Years ago, I was talking with Alex about a campaign to kind of shrink the city, to reduce the perception of the importance that the city plays in our own economy, to limit how it can behave here and overseas, to change the balance of power on a global scale as well as on a domestic scale. And I won't go more into the specifics, but tax is clearly one. Alex has talked about that. I know Jerome's going to talk about the debt law, very, very important, stop private sector handing global south countries. And my personal hobby horse, scrap ISDS, this corporate court system embedded in trade deals, which allows foreign corporations and only foreign corporations to sue governments for doing pretty much anything said corporations doesn't like. We've just been hit by a case here in the UK over the halting of the coal mine in Cumbria. You really couldn't come up with a better system, a better symbol of a world controlled by corporations than a legal system that only exists for transnational corporations and which trumps every other law on the planet. So scrap that. Sorry, that was more than one policy prescription. But there's a few for you to mull over.
Brill, fantastic. No, that was certainly concise at the end, and plenty, I think, for us to potentially pick up now and then in the discussion, expand upon. So thank you very, very much, Nick. Brill. Right, I'm going to keep our momentum going. Next up, we have Davika, who I'm going to hand over directly to now. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jack, and this is a great panel. It was very challenging to think about what to speak, because the brief was fairly vague, and I knew like all the other three people how they're going to speak about, so I'm going to be stepping on a bit on their toes. It's inevitable, unfortunately. But like the others, I think since we're talking about policy, of course, I think we all agree on the first policy prescription that is absolutely the top of our agenda is to end this genocide. I'm pretty sure I share the sentiment with practically everyone here that it's hard for me to think about literally anything else other than this. It occupies front and center of my mind. It genuinely took me a few hours to like snap out of thinking of that to even focus on, even thinking about what I can talk about today. And anyway, in a way, like the people of Palestine have paid an immense cost for this, but in many ways, it's like, I think people are finally snapping out of the idea that the liberal international order was actually an order of any kind. Maybe still people might still believe it, but the point is that it never worked for people in the global south. And very much of all of the systems that we're talking about today that shape our global economy, that shape how people live in the UK, in the US, in Europe, and how people live in the rest of the world is pretty much the same dynamic, and often is built on this idea. It's not built on this idea, it's built on these structures, as both Alex and Nick pointed out, are sort of neo-colonial and imperial. So 2 points I want to make before I get into anything else is that based on what we're seeing anyway, and historically, I think it's really important to recognize that the global economy is intertwined, and it always has been. and it's important to recognize as progressives that anything that happens in the UK or any policy that is implemented in the UK has an impact on the rest of the world. So in a way, like, I'm very glad we're having this conversation. I used to live in the US. I'm relatively a recent transplant to the UK, 3 years now. And one of my main gripes of living in the US was like, again, this is like 3-4 years ago, so maybe it's changed. It was like, it was crazily, it's just crazy insular, you know, people don't really care about, pardon my friends, they don't give a shit about what's happening in the rest of the world. And even progressives, they don't care about what's happening in the rest of the world. So it was really like alienating for me. And I'm glad that at least like in the UK, I'm not having this experience, given the fact that I'm being invited to chat about like what's happening in the global South and how is UK implicated. So that's great. So that's really helpful. And the second thing, I think, which I've already alluded to, is that the global economy is characterized by imperialism and neocolonialism, and development and growth in what are rich countries today has depended on and continues to depend on often underdevelopment, extraction, and or devastation in the global South. So based on, and you know, like, I'll take, like, we can take a quick short history of why this is the case. As we know, like, again, as I said, I'm from India, so decolonization, political decolonization is something that was like, you know, ingrained in me about when I was growing up in the 90s, about how important it was. And, you know, you have the sense of pride of how India especially like was part of the non-aligned movement, that we were one of the countries, our first prime minister was one of the people who started the non-aligned movement. And this idea that like in the 70s itself, this is of course post-Nehru, is that the system of political decolonization didn't really mean economic decolonization, in that political sovereignty did not come with true economic sovereignty in this liberal international order, which is again where the Bandung Conference comes in, the Declaration for a New International Economic Order in the 70s. And of course, like, that's a really hopeful moment. But of course, like, there's counter moves by old colonial powers to reassert their domination, financial, productive, and military. And even when like a post decolonization, almost all governments in the global South wanted to rebuild their economies in the way that, you know, all economies of Europe and the US have done post the Second World War, through industrialization policies, to trying to rebuild everything that was destroyed, and come up with like a national agenda of looking forward to the future in a way that benefits the people in their own countries. So essentially, basic social democracy that was set up in the UK, you know, over several decades, was all what, in many cases, was all what many developing country governments want, which was actively sabotage, partly through the monetary system, the trading system, all the various systems that people have already spoken about, and partly through, we should not forget, through documented coups and active sabotages of foreign governments, which were overthrown all over the world. So this is very important. And of course, on top of that is the Washington Consensus policies, and which have also furthered efforts for deindustrialization and created impoverishment all over the world. So, and of course, like, I don't want to simplify this by saying, like, because a lot of times, you know, when we make this argument, it's like a lot of people would say, oh, but, you know, but what about the domestic political economy of all these countries? Of course, that matters. But like, at this point, is even if you got the domestic political economy perfect, all of these constraints wouldn't mean that you would get nowhere. So, you know, when we're talking about internationally, let's just talk about what we can do about the international constraints. And, you know, we'll deal with political economy later. I can't possibly in 10 minutes. So I'm not going to do that. And so when, again, so this seems like history, but as both Nick and Alex have pointed out, that in many ways this is not an old system, this is a current system. And you know, like, as especially this year, as geopolitics has been moving really quickly, there are many things that have changed. But when it comes to certain things, like, you know, what is that saying? Plus ça change, plus ça même chose. It's like the more things change, the more things remain the same. I'm sure Jerome will tell us about the horrific debt situation that is faced, the debt crises that governments in the global South are facing. So I'm not gonna bore you with that right now, because I feel like it'll be repetitive. But I do have to say one thing, because it really blows my mind every time I hear it, is that, like, I think as of 2023, 54 developing nations, nearly half in Africa, dedicated at least 10% of government funds to debt interest payments, which means that about 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt payments than on health or education. Now, this is very much a system that results because of like the scuppered industrialization, the the insistence that developing countries should not be allowed to develop, should not be allowed to move up the value chain, and ensuring this continued dependent structure of the economy, where the development of global South countries depends on the development of not the development of the global North depends on the underdevelopment of the global South, is very much, and one of those is very much how the economy functions today. And one feature that I think I can talk about, which possibly nobody else will, I don't know, is the role of the US dollar. So once again, in a way, it was really challenging to think about, like, what is the UK policy? What can the UK policy do to change this? And in many ways, nothing, because the UK is no longer the center of the world. Like, the empire, thankfully, the British Empire is not the same anymore. Now we have to deal with the US empire. So a lot of the problems that developing countries face today is very much because of the nature of the monetary system, in which the US dollar is the central asset that every government, every country needs in order to further its own development. And at the end of the day, no matter what you do, you always come up against this sort of constraint that you run out of dollars. So for instance, again, this was pretty much the story for the last 70 years, is that governments would try to implement their own development policy, and they would come up against a constraint where they don't have enough. They either have a huge current account deficit, and they don't have enough capital flows coming in. And the thing that often precipitated, like, crises or debt crises or any other kind of crisis, they would run out of US dollars. Now this system has even become more and more entrenched. And a lot of times, we think that with the shift, the rise of China, it's maybe not so much, that's not so pronounced, but fundamentally the role of the US dollar has not changed, despite all the craziness that's happening in the United States. I believe the data says, like, the share of US dollar in official foreign exchange reserve is still about like 58% of total international foreign exchange reserves, as compared to like 60% in 2023. And many of the issues facing global South today come from the specific configuration of the international monetary system built around the US dollar. Basically, global South countries, governments, whenever they need the US dollar, whenever they need funding, they have to go to these extractive, horrific institutions of global governance that we all know about, the IMF, which I'm not going to start about because I will literally spend 30 minutes talking about how shit that organization is. So I'm not going to talk about it right now. We have to approach them, which extract the pound of flesh, ensure that your country imposes austerity policies, the same old playbook that we're so familiar with. And this is not the case for literally any other country of the global North. If you remember 2022, when was the mini budget? Like, when it was like, everything went to shit. And at that time, 2022, 22, yes. At the time, like, if there was any other global South country in that situation, you'd probably end up at the IMF, because because the markets would not allow that to happen. You'd run out of dollars, and you would have to go to the IMF to figure something out, which is again part of the reason why many countries are in debt distress, not because of catastrophic economic policy like Liz Truss, but still, you don't need to have catastrophic economic policy to end up in that situation when you're a global South country. But the Bank of England could easily, and in fact it did, knocked on the door of the Fed. In fact, it didn't have to, because it has a standing swap agreement with the Fed, and can borrow an unlimited amount of dollars from them. The asset that they need to get rid of the shortage is something that the countries of the global North, which have their own little club, I'm not making this up, this is true, is something that the system of countries of the global South are excluded from. And once again, this is by design to ensure that it's a system of discipline. So anyway, for me, one of the main problems is the US dollar. I have to wrap up now. And policy to fix this, there's not an easy policy solution, because the alternative to this is not to the US dollar as the main linchpin of the international monetary system, is not simply to do with the US dollar itself, but to do with the global monetary system in which the United States is a key imperial power. Of course, like, there's been as I think Nick was mentioning, as more and more big countries and big economies are being pushed out of this sort of sphere of influence, maybe things will change. However, it's unclear what's going to happen next. But importantly, a lot of regional groupings often get together to figure out what to do. I mean, a lot of people had hopes with the BRICS, which is I feel like there's no vision of internationalism in BRICS yet, but maybe the most recent overtures against India and Brazil, maybe that might make it a bit more internationalist. I doubt it. But again, the point is that there can be many of these regional groupings which can sort of produce small challenges to the US dollar, which can ultimately, hopefully in the future at some point, form the underpinning of a new financial system. But it's not easy, especially when you're thinking about challenging something as weighty as the US dollar in the global economy. But again, it's important to consider that this is in my view, one of the main problems that we face as a global economy today. So I know that's not very UK, but in the case, since the UK is very much a vassal state and sort of enforces the US imperial power, trying to figure out how they don't do that is an important policy objective for us. So I know that's vague. Sorry, I'm an academic. That's what I do.
It's okay. It is a policy for the UK to challenge the US dollar somehow. I mean, hopefully, perhaps that's something we can maybe people, the audience / other panelists have ideas on how the UK might sort of channel a challenged US dollar. Maybe that's what we can pick up on. But I will take it. To be fair, this is of all the panels we've had over the last few months, this was the broadest and perhaps most intractable anyway. So I think we will accept the broad policy of challenging the US dollar. Thank you very much, Dwika. And we'll quickly move on to our final speaker, which is Jerome Phelps.
Thanks. Everyone's been speaking really powerfully about the neo-colonial nature of the current international financial system. And Dwika mentioned how political independence in countries in the global south led straight into economic dependence. And perhaps the main tool of that neo-colonial extraction and control of global south is debt, which I'm going to talk about now. As the colonial armies left, they were immediately replaced by IMF delegations with loans and austerity conditions that prevented countries from investing in their industries, as the way that Dwika described, as global North countries had. And in the 21st century, the IMF is increasingly not even replaced, but complemented by BlackRock bondholders who don't even need to leave their offices in London and New York to extract high interest loan repayments from countries across the global south, generating increasing poverty, dehumanization, which we're seeing, as has been said in Palestine, how the step from that dehumanizing impoverishment towards actual genocide can be a short one. But it's also worth flagging that this extraction has a gendered aspect, that it's particularly on women, LGBTQI plus communities who carry the burden of care, who have to fill the gaps in the austerity policies imposed by cuts as a result of debt. And so there's a potential in a similar way to they do here, in fact, and in the global north. So there's a possible moment of solidarity there. I'm going to bring up my slides at this point and talk about the debt crisis now. If I can get into the slideshow. So it's we're in a critical debt crisis now. I mean, Dwika gave some statistics, put some more up there about how the massive increase in debt payments by global south countries since 2010, and the extent to which spending on debt is directly sucking money from healthcare, from education, from responding to the climate emergency, which was caused by the creditor countries and is overwhelmingly being experienced by the global south countries that did least to cause it. So in many countries, their debt payments are dramatically outstripping these crucial investments in a way that's can be devastating for communities. Why now? There was this is not the first debt crisis. My organization, Debt Justice, grew out of the Jubilee Debt campaign 25 years ago, and the last one. The debts have built back up for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the pandemic, the global instability that's certain food and fuel prices rising, and increase the interest rates that countries have to borrow at, obviously costs of the climate emergency. But also, as we've seen this retreat from countries in the global north providing aid, they've been in global south countries increasingly have to go to private creditors, who are now the largest creditor group. They don't lend at the concessional rates of the IMF even. They lend at sometimes 10% extortionate rates to countries at this point are often desperate for new loans simply to keep paying off the last loans. And negotiating with BlackRock to restructure your debt is not to be undertaken lightly. The international, the euphemistic international community, which in this case means the G20, because rich creditor countries are very keen not to have the debt system set in access in the UN or places where the global south or debtor countries have a voice. The G20 defined the international response to the debt crisis in the pandemic year 2020 with something called the Common Framework, which was meant to be a process that would enable countries in debt distress to restructure their debts in a way that was fair and involved all of their different creditor groups, countries, banks, bondholders, multilateral lenders, in a fair way. It's been almost complete failure. Only 4 countries have applied, despite this massive debt distress. The only country that's completed the process is Chad, which completed it by getting no debt relief because the oil traders who were the main creditors, Glencore, just sat on their feet until the debt had basically been paid off. Zambia's been waiting nearly 5 years. Private creditors can hold out, play hardball, can often continue to get paid, and until the countries that are desperate to get out of this process fold and gave them really generous terms that allows them to keep making often big profits on their failed gambles on high risk, high interest loans. They're at high interest because they're risky. They're a gamble. That's the point. That's why they charge 10%. But when the gamble goes wrong, when Zambia defaults, they still make vastly greater profits than if they'd invested in US treasuries. The UK on debt, the UK, we may be a vassal state, but the empire isn't fully dead. There's still all these left holdovers of empire, not least the English legal system. 90% of debt contracts are governed by English law. So if there's disputes, it's the High Court in London that they get resolved. This means in practice that private creditors, when they're holding out, they have the gun to the heads of indebted countries that they can sue in London and seek to be repaid in full. Countries are desperate to avoid this, so this is partly why the private creditors are getting such favourable deals, or countries are just keeping paying at the expense of health education. So at the moment, South Sudan, one of the poorest and most conflict-riven countries in the world, is being sued in the High Court by oil traders BB Energy. It was successfully sued last month by another commercial lender. And there's been explicit threats from Ethiopia's private creditors. Ukraine has got vulture funds on its trail, and a real risk of being sued in London. So UK has not just an opportunity, but a real responsibility to do something about this. The good news for once is that it's not a silver bullet. The big complicated thing is we need a fair international debt system governed by the UN, which Global South can have a role in shaping. First step towards that is much easier because the UK could do it unilaterally and it wouldn't cost the taxpayer a penny. The UK needs to pass a law that would prevent BlackRock from suing for more than it would have got had it participated with other creditors in an agreed debt restructuring. And would suspend, this law could also suspend debt payments whilst they're negotiating. So that would change the dynamic. Suddenly, BlackRock's not being paid. BlackRock knows that if it goes to court, it's not going to get any more than it would have got by playing nicely with the other creditors. So it suddenly that would shift the dynamic. So private creditors would have to participate in debt restructuring negotiations and not hold out. This is a strong demand coming out of particularly Africa. There's been a recent African Union statement, a letter from their commissioners and ambassadors in the UK to the UK government, and African governments were in the forefront of the demanding that this remain in the statement of the Financing for Development conference in June, which called for these jurisdictions to pass legislation. It's also similar legislation is being in the works in New York, which is the other place where these are governed. And it's in fact Labour, the last Labour government passed similar, more limited legislation in 2010. So there's precedent, it's actually achievable. There's a private member's bill which is before Parliament, due to be discussed in Parliament on Friday. It won't be because Treasury says no, but it's a winnable key objective of a progressive platform that could make a real difference to the Global South. Thank you.
Real fantastic. Thank you, Jerome. We've got a great range of policies from our speakers as I add various people back to be pinned speakers. So we've had everything from public country by country, country reporting. So multinationals have to report the scale of economic activity, profits declared, taxes paid. We've had scrapping ISDS, allowing foreign corporations to sue national governments, shrinking the city. We've had challenging the US dollar, and how the UK might do that. And yeah, we've had the debt justice law particularly as well from Jerome, which the UK do cost us very little. Just trying to see if I can find our final panelist. Anyway, Alex, to add to the... Oh no, there we are. You are back. Fantastic. Brilliant. So we can open to the floor if people have any questions. They can use a raise hand function or drop them in the chat in the first place. Otherwise, I'll sort of begin by abusing chair privileges as it... There we go. Alex is coming back to the call now. You abuse my privilege. I suppose at the start of some of those conversations, there was a bit of a discussion around the aid budget and the way that's been cut by recent governments and the sort of lack of restoration by Labour. And this is both, I guess, an opportunity to shift away from a focus on aid, but it's both a blunt tool and the sort of ineffective to actually negatively impacted ways it's been used by the UK in the past. But do you think should nevertheless something like restoration of the aid budget or increase of the aid budget, etc., which is often used, I guess, as a sort of point to policy by certain people on the progressive left, should that form part of a progressive policy consensus, or should we use this as an opportunity to move away from thinking about that as the sort of core of what, of core focus maybe of what the progressive international policy might look like? I don't know if anyone wants to come in first, particularly on that.
I'm happy to give it a go. I mean, look, I do think that redistribution is a very important. I mean, reparations is one thing which is very important, absolutely. But even leaving that aside, redistribution is important within a country, and I think it should be important globally as well, in an ongoing way. I think the question is whether the setup of how aid is delivered, it makes it very, very difficult for it to perform that role in a way that, I mean, it's almost, you compare it to, well, we all pay tax and rich people pay more tax because it's part of redistribution, and they pay for a health service for themselves and everybody else as well, right? And you can kind of imagine something like that globally, but if you compare that to the aid budget, it would be like rich people deciding on their own pet projects that supposedly help the rest of society, which is not. So I think we need to reconceptualize it. And there is some work being done on this. There's something called GPI, which I always is terrible. It needs a decent name, and I forget what it stands for all the time. But it is quite a good idea. It is the idea of an international fund, essentially, which everybody pays into. But if you're at the poorer end, you don't pay very much at all. And everybody gets something back. So even if you're a very rich country, you'll probably get a little bit back, but it won't be very much at the top end. So there's kind of universalism in there, which for me is a more interesting way long term of thinking about the redistributive function, which at its best the aid budget should be used for.
Real fantastic. Does anyone else have anything particularly to add to the question of, I guess, aid and the aid budget as a sort of central locus for progressive policy discussions around industrial development?
I mean, I would just like to add to what Nick said, that in the history of the modern economy, not a single country has developed on the back of aid. It's never happened and never will happen, because when it comes to like even the smallest national economy, the scale of aid is tiny, and it often comes with, like, as Nick pointed out, the whims of billionaires. So I would rather, like, Tony Blair, Bill Gates, all these people who who wrecked the world in the past, to butt out, honestly. And I know that reparations, as Nick already mentioned, like, that's the kind of redistribution we need, but I think I'm even being more unrealistic as compared to saying challenging the power of the US dollar when I talk about reparations, because that's really the kind of reparatory justice we need. But once again, I feel like if we fix all these other things, we don't need aid, because a lot of, through just the normal functionings of the fiscal policy and tax, etc. Again, if all of these things were not holding a lot of governments back, you don't need aid. But anyway, idealistic bit.
Fantastic.
I might just throw on top of that, if I can, Jack. I absolutely agree. I think the additional thing, if we look back now, there was a brief period, and it was only really 5 or 10 years, when a UK government could be shamed by having it revealed that UK aid had been kind of doing good things for the UK instead of for the world. And that was long gone before we began to see these cuts. We were so far past that moment when even the intention was to do good for others. So let's not kid ourselves. On top of that, we're in a political moment where, for all that we need to keep talking about the UK's responsibilities and the need for reparations, the actual fiscal decision about allocating money to aid when people are so upset about what's happening to their public services makes this a toxic place to go. And we know that the aid budget, in any case, is far, far less than what could be achieved by fixing the international tax rules, for example, which would also be good for UK revenues. So why would we take ourselves down this toxic road when we could, do something that is popular at both sides? And just Nick mentioned the Global Public Investment Network. I expect a prize for remembering that. There's also work we did on climate funding, right? If you had something like Spain's wealth tax and you applied that in every country around the world with slight improvements, you'd raise something like $2.1 trillion a year, more than enough for every country to meet their responsibilities to a reasonable global climate fund and have some left, or in many cases receive a great deal, to fund domestic human development aims. So we can very easily construct mechanisms that allow benefits at every end and include a reparative principle. And we should be thinking about that, not aid. Aid is gone.
Real fantastic. I mean, I can pass on to Sherman if he's got any thoughts, particularly on that, but also if not, I will usefully move on to the first question that's come in, so posed to you, but then obviously if anyone else has any thoughts. But lots been made by debts being created to China and the global economy. Is this impacting on strategies around pursuing debt justice?
Good question. Yes, China is now a major lender, which obviously makes restructurings more complex. In the past, the Western governments had their cartel and the Paris Club that could make the rules behind the closed doors themselves. That's trickier. However, the narrative coming out of the US-UK establishment around the China debt trap implies that China is this uniquely malign, manipulative lender that's trying to draw countries into debt crisis just to exploit them. Firstly, Chinese lending amounts to 19% of payments, whereas, 13%, whereas Western private creditors at 39%. It's a large player compared to other individual countries, but small as part of the overall creditor group. Secondly, debt trap diplomacy, that's what the West's been doing since colonialism. This is a classic projection. China is much less interested in imposing conditions, in enforcing membership. Obviously, it's using it as a tool of diplomacy, but it's less brutal than the IMF in terms of setting domestic policies of countries. So it's this line that nothing can be done about debt because China is completely disingenuous. In fact, one of the beauties of one of the things that the legislation would do is start to rebuild trust with China. China has participated in debt restructuring initiatives on the understanding that Western private creditors would too, which didn't happen in the debt service suspension initiative. It's for the West to rebuild trust with China, and steps like this would be a important first step for that.
Does anyone else have anything to say, particularly about China and debt, or I guess more broadly about other international players in the global system? If not, we can move on to the next question. In which case, I'll move on to Sarah Jane's question, which was, should the UK be trying to push for reforms at World Bank and IMF, given our significant voting rights, or is it a lost cause or a waste of time, given there's a Trump government in the US? Does anyone want to jump in on that one in particular? It's a big question.
I can start.
Bro, thank you.
Yeah, I have a special hatred for these institutions, but I mean, in a way, with the Trump government, which is not really interested in multilateralism, perhaps it's a good opportunity. However, given the structure of both these institutions, where it's really the creditors that hold the decision-making power, and they're never going to give it up, like, I don't know if there's any amount of reform unless we sort of take away the proportional sort of that whoever puts in more money into the system gets to call the shots, which is the case it is right now with the IMF and the World Bank, unless they would give that up, which I don't see any reason or any situation which they would change that unless it's wrested from them, which once again, how? It seems kind of pointless. But I do recognize that these are like extremely important institutions and do come with, like, they are lenders of last resort in an international system, in the international monetary system. That being said, like, already this is kind of where why governments and central banks have been holding foreign exchange reserves. That's why they would borrow from China as opposed to the IMF or other lenders, to try to sort of avoid them anyway. So I feel like if there was sort of I think it'd be probably more productive to think about what kind of alternatives we can build, which doesn't require relying on the IMF, because it's a very intransigent system, and unfortunately also based on US power. So I'm not sure it can be reformed.
No, yeah, but thanks for that. I mean, I've just realised Connor's question, but he also, I guess, integrates here, talking a little bit about United Nations General Assembly and other organisations, I guess, beyond the economic sphere and moving towards structural change. So I guess, yeah, both international economic institutions like World Bank, the IMF, but also some of the political institutions too. Does anyone else have anything to jump in on this? Particularly, yeah, Jerome, Brill.
Come in on the UN General Assembly, maybe. I mean, I think we have, for all the very good reasons for cynicism and skepticism about the UN, it's still at bare minimum a space where global south countries have a voice, and when so much is decided in totally unaccountable cartels of rich global north countries, then we have to keep using that, and with a clear eye of how limited and flawed it is. So, for example, the The UN financing for development process this year has generated some important statements, which the UK and which the EU, US tried very hard to get taken out and didn't succeed for once. So there is, apart from the reference to legislation and relevant jurisdictions, there is a very, very weakened down statement that gets at the idea of a UN Global Debt Convention or some form of UN-based debt process. So I think that UNGA, the UN General Assembly, could be a really valuable next step for Global South countries to take that text to a vote there, where there's a real chance of winning it, and try and learn from the progress that's been made on the tax convention, for example, and try to use the UN in creative confrontational ways to force change past reluctant rich countries.
Probably worth saying, isn't it, that I think both Sarah and Connor's question point to the fact that, you know, we have a set of highly compromised institutions at a global level, and it's not easy to point to any of them. Some of them perform useful functions in an ideal world. I mean, like you said about, you know, the IMF being a lender of last resort, the WTO as well. I mean, it's interesting at the moment that actually some of the big defenders of the WTO are actually the countries that have been most critical of it, because they now see we could be entering a world with no rules whatsoever, where the bully gets to do everything they like, and that's scary. I do think as movements and as activists, the changes that we need are so dramatic that it's almost worth saying what we actually want and rethinking the institutions fundamentally. I mean, there comes a point at which I suppose it is possible for institutions to transform themselves, but it's only going to happen in the face of massive popular pressure. And I think one of the problems, even at looking at the UN, I mean, the UN was an extremely useful institution in the 1960s and 1970s, but it was a useful institution because of the governments of the global south that forced it to be a useful institution. Now, you know, I have no power to create a world really where those governments are going to be able to play that role again, but movements in the global south do. And so I suppose as an activist, one of the things that I still think is important is showing our solidarity to those movements in the global south who are able to push and create governments that could potentially turn some of these institutions into something radically different and something that was genuinely useful. And maybe that, you know, I do think at the moment it's kind of sad that our certainly for the last 10 years, I think internationalism in this country and on the left has been fairly low. And I would like to think how we can re-engage people in that process of thinking through solidarity in the campaigns that they're running, because that's the only way I think we will end up with institutions, multilateral international institutions that are genuinely doing something useful and worth defending.
Well, Alex, yeah, do you have anything to add?
You know, just to add on, you know, on the tax side, I think there are real causes for optimism. You know, and Jerome pointed at it. You know, it took 5 years from the global tax justice movement agreeing a collective strategic aim of getting a convention. Once we'd kind of lost the chance of a global tax body in Addis in 2015, we took a couple of years to come together on this. 5 years after that, the African finance ministers passed a declaration calling on the UN to begin those negotiations. And with that, the Africa Group committed and led the process all the way through. Now, it hasn't been a perfect process, but the elements of transparency that the UN has that no other forum does, and especially not the OECD on tax, give you an accountability that you don't get anywhere else. So, you know, the Financing for Development declaration, we know the United States and Israel and Argentina were the only countries to vote against or abstain, and we wouldn't know that somewhere else. Not only that, but if it was somewhere else, I think there's a good chance that a lot of European countries and perhaps the UK would also have voted against, knowing that they couldn't be held accountable for it. So that on its own really shifts things. And we're already seeing in the negotiations of the tax convention, different dynamics between countries because they know that their publics can see them. So, you know, that alone matters, even if other aspects of the institution aren't perfect. But more than that, I think what you see on tax is the dynamic that might be the one we really need to pursue in the next 5 and more years, depending how the world goes, which is ways of coming together as countries to defend collectively national sovereignty. It is only if the other OECD members come together with the G77 that we'll see a collective force to resist what Donald Trump is now explicitly saying, that he will not allow other countries to tax US multinationals. Well, either we have to give up our revenues in a position where we all need them and say we're going to wait for the bully to go away, or we have to stand together to reduce the chances of being picked off. And the place that we can do that and make commitments to one another as well, so that everyone knows we're in it, is the United Nations. The tax convention has the potential to do that. Finding the same kind of dynamic on the debt, I think, is vital to make that fly. Who's in the room and who has to be there? US multinationals will soon force the Trump administration back into those negotiations because they know that they will be affected by whatever is agreed. In the minute, we've got a kind of a window to make it as good as we can before that happens. That dynamic on debt is needed, and I think increasingly in other areas, because if we're going to negotiate stuff and build new institutions, it has to start in a place with those characteristics, or we're going to recreate other bad institutions in other bad ways. And that seems like something we don't have time or resources for now.
Well, we've just had another question come in, which is, do you believe that the UK could work towards a framework that not only distance itself from its colonial past and present, but would step away from it altogether? So I guess this is a broader look at the sort of chances potentially for the UK to actually begin to, I guess, tackle and step away from its colonial past. Big question. Does anyone have anything to immediately jump on that? Prospects in the UK for challenging our legacies?
I mean, I think to challenge the legacy or move away from it would do all of the things that we mentioned. It would be the UK government and like the institutions in the UK would have to actively work to dismantle those. And I don't know, is that even possible? Yeah, because I feel like the first step needs to be reparations, but at this point, I think it very much is so that I'm not sure. I know it's changed a lot, but still there's not a lot of awareness to the extent to which what the British Empire was and what its impacts are. In fact, that you can see that in terms of the narratives around migration today that you see in the UK. And of course, like part of it is to do with like, a couple of decades of neoliberal austerity, which has resulted in sort of genuine disaffection for good reason, which again, politicians are blaming on the migrants. But at the same time, the migrants are coming to the UK partly because of the dynamics that we all mentioned that have ensured that their own countries aren't necessarily viable homes for them, or they're literally fleeing catastrophe, climate catastrophe or otherwise. So yeah, I'm not sure if people, I don't know if people genuinely understand the extent and the impact of the British Empire. But that being said, I do think there's a lot of power that is still held in the government and various institutions, as several of us pointed out. So possibly.
Well, it's a big question. I mean, I'll let everyone else sort of tackle that in course, but potentially I'll sort of pose maybe, unless anyone else drops any questions, what may be a final question. Just, I guess, picking on what Nick and others have talked about, that maybe there's a sort of return to the internationalism on parts of the progressive left, partly out of pretty dire, horrific global circumstances and challenges presented by the system and its challenges to the right of it. However, if this is opening up sort of more attention on some of the sort of global imperial issues for progressives and on the left, I mean, what lessons probably should we be taking, or might we take from I guess the biggest most recent previous wave of interest around the turn of the millennium, maybe as someone who's a little bit distant from that, and if there was maybe a key again, especially for a key takeaway, but if there was something that you would take from that, from a previous turn of interest towards, potentially a new wave following the genocide in Gaza, geopolitical instability, climate crisis, what might that be? Is there anything to take from that we should think as we sort of go back to international?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think on both those questions, I mean, it's my job to be hopeful, right? So I'm going to have to say something hopeful because I run a campaign organization. But I think there is a radically different understanding of the world on the part of people under 30 today than there were even at the height of the anti-globalization movement, which I would say was a major, highlight in my life and of internationalism in general. There was not as many people, young people in particular, who were part of that as today, I would say, young people who feel strongly about what's going on in Palestine, for example. Young people who feel strongly about and support radical solutions on climate change, on migration. This really is something new. I was still quite unusual when I was that age in thinking these things, despite the fact we had this great international network. So I think we need to draw some hope from that, surely. And I have no idea. I'm sure whatever they create is not simply going to be a repeat of what we saw in the past, and I don't know what it's going to look like. But I do have some hope there, and I just hope that those people are far enough away from some of the formal, not just the institutions of empire, but the kind of propaganda around it and so on, and this idea of this kind of goal that maybe we can have some hope there. I mean, the second point, that would be the final thing I'll say, if you like, that gives me hope is, and I've really enjoyed being on this panel. It's given me lots of ideas, but one of the ideas I think is this idea that we're a vassal state, and Trump is making that more and more obvious. And that's not to say we're in the same position as Ghana, obviously. But I do think the threat to our sovereignty is explicit, really explicit. I mean, Trump's coming over right next week. He's bringing with him a load of tech bros. They are talking about doing a tech deal, right? A form of trade deals, which basically hands over sovereignty of our tech sector to the robber barons. I think, and in many ways, Trump for me is a political expression of monopoly capitalism, right? It's just that let's ditch the idea that monopoly capitalism sits side by side with liberal democracy. It doesn't. It sits side by side with something far more authoritarian and ugly. And I think that is becoming obvious to a lot of people in our society, whatever they think about what goes on. And for me, that is an easier place, in a sense, to make the connections between how most people in the world feel about the international economic structures than what we had in the 1990s. So again, I think there is something here to fight. And Jeremy, I know, is on the call, and he's written a whole book about this. Isn't just tech. This is a turn of fight in finance as well, and a nexus between tech and finance. That's what we're fighting here. And I think a global struggle on that is where we need to go, and is possible.
Brilliant, fantastic. Anyone else for sort of, I guess, final comments, whether that's particularly to the question as Jeremy applauds in the background, whether on what I said or final concluding comments you particularly want to offer. I can take people into, I can either point people out, or if there's anything to say, if people haven't got anything to say, that's also fine.
I'll say one thing quickly. Look, I appreciate Nick's optimism that maybe there's an opportunity for global solidarity in what feels like quite it's going to be a long running slide further into authoritarian corruption around the world. At the same time, just thinking about the UK, I go back to Gurinder Bambra's analysis of the UK's crowning achievement of the welfare state never being appreciated for the amount of funding that was taken from the colonies to do it, and increasingly as people from those colonies and former colonies came with an interest in living here, there was this desire to put up the drawbridge so that they couldn't have our welfare state. I feel like, if anything, we've fallen further and further backwards on that lately, and it's only when the British public at large kind of, takes stock in a different kind of way of where the welfare state was built and how, and who paid for it and was excluded, that we get to the possibility that, perhaps Una's question of when might the UK be able to step away altogether. Unfortunately, I think far too many people would like to step away in a different way and wash their hands and say it never happened. But getting to the point where we could really reckon with, where our good fortune and privilege has come from just feels very far away. Sorry.
All good, Brill. How about
just final thoughts about all of this. I feel like I agree. As I kind of alluded to earlier in my comments when I was saying, I think I think anything that is any movement, any progressive movement that is not internationalist is going to fail, given the global interconnections and the fact that, like, once again, now everyone has seen the true face of what the global economy is, what global politics looks like. I don't think there's any going back. I mean, this sounds like really silly because I feel like, given in the UK, despite all the messaging, despite all the horrific narratives that we've been hearing about migrants, about like migrants coming and ruining the UK, and all the crap that we've heard for so long, despite that, you see the excitement that there is for like genuine left alternatives. I'm sorry, like, I'm not that old, but I've never seen that before in my life, and I feel like that genuinely does give me hope, given that like both of the genuine left alternatives seem like genuine left alternatives that are like truly internationalist and are hopefully rejecting these like fascist narratives, and I think that's extremely important. And yeah, again, like I teach a lot of young people, so sometimes it's like I swing between despair and amazing hope, because Nick is absolutely right. Like, you've never seen, I've genuinely, not in my generation, once again, it's never was the case that it was, you could see so much sympathy for what I think is just socialism amongst young people, which is really great. But of course, like, it's not homogenous. But yes, like, I think people are genuinely moved by the scale of what we're seeing in Palestine. And this is what I'm saying, the people of Palestine have paid a huge price for this. And I feel like we cannot let it go in vain, and I don't think, I don't know, I can't help but hope. How else am I gonna get out of bed? But so yeah.
Well, thanks, speaker. Jerome, a final word.
Yeah, I agree with all the other speakers. We can't turn the clock back to the colonial-funded welfarism of the 20th century, or even the white saviorism tainted campaigning of 20, 30 years ago. We've got to go with the opportunities of the moment now, of the networks young, and the structural basis for solidarity now, that the big tech finance complex are exploiting all of us. They're destroying all of our planet. They're forcing us all into precarity and cannibalizing the care economy. There are bases which are going to be really hard to find and activate, but they are structurally there for global internationalist solidarity, and that's what we need to be activating.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jerome. Well, we're just about to approach 8 o'clock, which was the finish time for this event. So all I have to say is a massive thank you for the panel for some really brilliant contributions. Thank you for your questions as well. Nick was very polite not mentioning that he's organising the anti-Trump demo next Wednesday. We will be broadly at the same time as our final Forum 2029 in-person event in London. We won't hold it against you for going to stop Trump. But hopefully we can squeeze a few of you away to our final event, which will be a live recording for the Macrodose podcast. We should have Nadia Whittam, James Schneider, who's involved with founding the New Party for Progressive International. We have many other speakers. We've got John McTernan coming, which will be fun as well. So if you'd like to come to that, you can sign up through the Autonomy website. That'll be fantastic, and hope to see plenty of you there. But yeah, again, thanks to our panel. Have a great evening, and I guess free Palestine as well.